I'm Abby, I have a lot of records, and when I suggested the working title of today's video with my guest, he suggested I change it. It sounded too much like a homework assignment. So now, this is SMiLE from the inside. So I first heard of the lost Beach Boys album SMiLE through this anthology. Shake It Up, Great American Writing on Rock and Pop from Elvis to Jay-Z. The essay in question was Goodbye Surfing, Hello God, about the myth of the then shelved SMiLE. Of note is this essay's telling of the infamous magic fire music incident. This is me we're talking about here. Of course I kept the hat! 5 years after Shake It Up was assigned as my Writing 101 textbook in college, I made the Vinyl Monday Season 2 finale. On the greatest album never made, I explored the history of SMiLE and compared a handful of iterations of the album in my collection, including this bootleg from the 80s, the SMiLE Sessions LP from 2011, and 2004's Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE. Last December, the official Brian Wilson Instagram page posted about this upcoming book about the making of Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE. Specialized books like these are so important for Vinyl Monday research. I was super excited, but still not thinking I'd get to talk about SMiLE again anytime soon. I'd missed the 20th anniversary at this point, and I know for a fact that I will not still be doing Vinyl Monday when the 30th rolls around. I'd miss my chance. Or so I thought. If there's anything I really should have learned by now through Vinyl Monday, it's that lightning does in fact strike twice, and nothing is by accident. Back in February, I heard from today's guest. He said something along the lines of, if you're doing a book Monday, I'd love to chat with you. Today is not a Monday, but you don't pass up something like this. Last week, I got to speak with author, beautiful dreamer Brian Wilson and the Story of SMiLE director and educator David Leaf. We talked all about his new book, SMiLE, The Rise, Fall, and Resurrection of Brian Wilson, that very same book I saw on the official Brian Wilson Instagram page. We spoke for almost 2 hours. Here's most of it. Did want to start this off with something. Not only have you published this history of Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE in text, you also directed Beautiful Dreamer, which I just rewatched. So I wanted to thank you for being one of the curators of this album's history. My SMiLE episode would not have been possible without your work.
Thank you. My life almost would not be possible without SMiLE. So we can agree to that.
I'm going to kick this off on that note with maybe a bigger question. Why SMiLE?
I was in college. I had studied, I started as a journalism major and studied Edward R. Murrow, the great broadcast and radio and television journalist who George Clooney made a movie about, Good Night, Good Luck, and is now starring on Broadway in an adaptation of that movie. And what I learned about Murrow was that by telling a story, you could actually change the outcome of the story. And that stuck with me. I wasn't thinking of any particular story at that time, but I was in college in Washington, D.C. during the Nixon administration, very contentious times. I used to joke we got tear gassed whether we wanted to or not.
Jesus.
And so I was wondering what was happening to democracy. I went to see Norman Mailer speak with a friend of mine from high school, and we got chased by the police wielding giant clubs. And I was saying, wait a second, this is the right of assembly. This is the right of free speech. What's going on?
Yeah.
Another day, I opened the blinds to my dorm window, and the 81st or 82nd Airborne Division was getting out of armored vehicles to surround our campus. And so it just stuck with me that something was wrong. I didn't know what, but there was kind of this self-righteous anger. And then when I was 19, I stumbled upon the story of Brian Wilson and SMiLE. And it was really by accident. I
Through
bought
Rolling Stone, yes.
through Rolling Stone magazine. My first issue of Rolling Stone, the Beach Boys were on the cover. It's the first time I ever heard the name Brian Wilson, the first time I ever heard about SMiLE. And then that inspired me to go buy the Surf's Up album, which of course ends with the tour de force song Surf's Up. Surf's up. It became an obsession with my roommate and I. We went down the rabbit hole as much as one could without the internet. And we became obsessed with Brian Wilson and SMiLE.
So it
And
was so sorry to interrupt. It was a lot harder to find information about this thing back then.
it was really difficult. The thing that one of the things that drove me was the song before Surf's Up on the album was Till I Die. Which when I heard that for the first time, this is one of the saddest songs I've ever heard, but it proved that Brian's creative powers were still intact. And it inspired me to go to the college newspaper, for which I had only written sports articles, and say, hey, could I write a review of this album? And I eventually became music editor of the school paper. I had never thought about writing about music up until then. But as my roommate and I began talking obsessively about SMiLE, I said, something is wrong here. This is my Edward R. Murrow brain. I'm looking at this story and it just doesn't make sense. And I was really upset. And he goes, well, if you think something's wrong, why don't you do something about it? And I said, okay, I'm going to move to California, write a book about Brian Wilson, become his friend, and help him finish SMiLE. It was that crazy a notion.
Yeah, it's so rare that fans become part of a history of an album like this, like you did.
No, if there's anything to compare it to, because there is nothing like SMiLE. Brian Wilson starts work on it in 1966 and presents it to us in 2004. So there's almost a 38-year gap between when he starts working on it and when we actually hear it. And one of my favorite quotes in the book comes from LA Times pop writer Randy Lewis. Mozart was born, lived his entire life, created his entire body of work, and died in less time than it took for Brian to finish SMiLE. And so it's just a remarkable story, in and of itself, a remarkable story. But to go to the heart of your question, when I heard Surf's Up and I read about it, I thought, why would anybody oppose this music? And I want to hear it all. I need to hear this music. And so I was driven by both altruistic and selfish reasons.
Which is those are pretty college kid motivations.
Well, I was a college kid, very naive about how the world worked. I didn't understand any of the complications of Beach Boys' career. I didn't really know anything about the music business at all. And when I moved to California, even though I had worked a little bit in New York radio and television and had friends in the music business, I still had no sense of what it would take to bring SMiLE into the world. I think of it now that this was a mission, that it was a calling, that I was driven to do this by the same powers that drove Brian to create SMiLE. The best example I can give of it is I wasn't in California 36 hours, and I crossed the street, and walking towards me was Dennis Wilson. Wow. And I walked up to him, and I never lacked for confidence. And I said to him, hi, Dennis, my name is David Leaf. I just moved to California to write a book about your brother, Brian. And he laughed, and he thought it was hysterical at the notion. And he said, good luck. And he walked into a small brick building, which I later found out was Brother's studio. But the fact that I had met him, I don't know, it made it seem possible. From back east, there was no way it was going to happen. So my moving to California was the instigation of it all. And I had lots of other ambitions as a screenwriter, as a comedy writer, but my work with Brian has always been my North Star. Thank you.
That was a fantastic answer. Wow, thank you so much. So this is a music show. I have to ask a fellow music fan about being a music fan. And you touched on SMiLE being born into a completely different world than it was first created in. Those 30 some odd years of separation. Um, Clearly, the Beach Boys went through warp speed transformation in just a couple years.
In my listening, the Beatles had gone from "I Want to Hold Your Hand" Say to me, you let me hold your hand, to "Strawberry Fields Forever" in 3 years. Nothing is real.
I had a question about that, but please finish your answer. I'm so glad you brought that up.
And so I didn't understand why could the Beach Boys go from Surfing USA to Surf's Up in 3 years? What was it about their circumstances that were so really 180 degrees the opposite of what the Beatles were going through? And I've come up with some answers. One of the things about SMiLE that even though I've now written more words about Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys than I think anybody else alive, nobody has all the answers. And of course, nobody will really know what happened. I list, I don't know, about a dozen answers as to why Brian shelved SMiLE. And I say it's all of them, and it's not any one of them in particular. And so we have this guy who is absolutely unique in the 1960s. You know, Stevie Wonder in the 1970s proved that, yes, somebody could do it all. They could write, arrange, produce, and play and sing on everything. But at that time in the 1960s, it was unheard of. The Pet Sounds album, which blew everybody in the music world out of the water, was Brian's musical autobiography. Not a very happy story when you listen to it from that point of view. I just wasn't made for these times. It's a very, very sad admission for somebody to be making, but clearly he knew there was trouble ahead.
Would you say like Pet Sounds is a more realist piece?
What Brian told me was the reason he picked Van Dyke Parks for SMiLE was that Pet Sounds was too close to the bone. It was too emotional. It was too real. And he wanted to do something that wasn't as emotional for him. Now, as the composer of the music, his emotions come through the music. But the lyrics that Van Dyke wrote, some of them abstract, some of them, hard to grasp, were perfect for the music because it made you have to listen over and over again to get what he was saying, if you could ever get what he was saying. These ideas that Van Dyke and Brian were talking about were American ideas that weren't easily grasped. In the same way, the songs, the music of SMiLE, it wasn't top 40 radio music at that time.
SMiLE, can read as a little goofy to, the first pass listener. Because, there's sound effects, there's slide whistles, there's a song about eating your vegetables. I'm gonna keep well my vegetables, car off and shell. So what is it about SMiLE that eventually converts even the most staunch of skeptics?
It is goofy. And Brian, for the book, I did 25 new interviews in addition to all the interviews I've done through the years. And one of the themes that kept coming through was that Brian loved to make people laugh. Yes. That had nothing to do with music. So for SMiLE, the idea was in certain places on the album, he would want people to laugh and think, God, that's silly. But what converts a new listener to SMiLE? It's the depth and beauty of songs like Wonderful and Cabanescence and Surf's Up, the otherworldly sounds of wind chimes. I mean, there's a title called Do You Like Worms?
Yes.
Well, I mean, I don't know anybody who likes worms. I'm not friends with any birds, but the idea, Do You Like Worms, is a title for a song. You look at it and go, what the heck is he talking about? Well, listen to the music, listen to the lyric. After a while, you might get it. But I think the music is just so ineffably beautiful that you're going to listen and you're going to listen again. And I remember the first time, obviously, that I heard Surf's Up, but I remember hearing Cabanescence And Our Prayer, which opens the album, Brian in 1966 was telling reporters, I'm going to write a teenage symphony to God. Well, that's an unbelievable statement
Yes.
to throw down. He also told a UK reporter, this is how confident Brian was in the middle of 1966. He said, our new album is going to be as advanced from Pet Sounds as Pet Sounds was from Summer Days and Summer Nights. So he had raised the bar. So he wasn't worried about whether he could achieve what he wanted to achieve. And long before SMiLE was, shelved, Good Vibrations had come out.
Oh, phenomenal.
So there was no question he could do it. The question was, would he be given the time, space, support, love, and conviction that, yes, you're doing the right thing, do it.
Mm-hmm.
And he wasn't. That's the rise and fall in the
Yes.
subtitle, The Rise and Fall of Brian Wilson. And what happened in 2003, 2004 is the resurrection.
There's a lot wrapped up in SMiLE. How do you, as a writer, maintain some degree of objectivity while writing about a piece of art that has so much emotion wrapped up into it?
I don't know that objectivity was part of the goal. Part of the goal was fairness. Am I telling this story in a way that's fair? And so the question, when I was a young person of 25 writing the Beach Boys and the California Myth on this kind of, with this missionary zeal, trying to grab the world by their shoulders and say, you got to pay attention to this guy, Brian Wilson. He's really important. Well, now I'm an elder statesman, if you will. and so how do I tell the story? Well, actually, in a way that's objective. The way I tell it is by letting other people tell it. This book is an oral history from the people who were there, from the people who I spoke with, either for the making of Beautiful Dreamer, or in the case of somebody like Derek Taylor and Chuck Britz, who I had interviewed back in the 70s and who were no longer with us by the time Beautiful Dreamer was made. And so through the years, I have formed kind of an educated idea of what happened. Is my story right? Well, in the book, I talk about the notion of looking at the story of SMiLE through a kaleidoscope. And so I'm looking at it through my kaleidoscope. And if you turn it, it's going to look different. Now, does that make it less objective? Does that make it less fair? Does that make it less honest? I don't think so. This is the story as particularly in the resurrection era. I lived through it. I was with Brian in the 1990s, talking to him about SMiLE, getting him to put SMiLE music on the Good Vibrations box set in 1993. And I wrote and produced the All-Star Tribute where he performed Heroes and Villains for the first time. So I had a hand along the way in making him comfortable with the idea that this music was something that the world should hear. He had been told it wasn't. But what he had been told primarily was that it was inappropriate for the Beach Boys. And again, we come back to, what does that mean? So the Beatles were an artistic entity and the Beach Boys had become a business. The question was, would SMiLE be good for the Beach Boys business? And the answer might well have been no. I mean, there are stories that Tony Escher told me during the making of Pet Sounds where people were trying to get Brian to endorse checks made out to him. That's business. I don't have time for business. They say, Tony, could you get Brian just to endorse this check so we can deposit it in his account? Brian wasn't interested in that. He was obsessed with making beautiful music. And we're the lucky recipients of it.
How did you go about painting the fullest picture of Brian the man?
That's a really good question. Like by talking to people who knew him before he was. By the way, Brian didn't ever like being called a genius. He said, "I'm ingenious, clever, and certainly hardworking." Book opens with a quote from Albert Einstein, who is indisputably a genius, and Van Dyke Parks, who met Albert Einstein when he was just a 9-year-old, says, I've been in the presence of genius. I know genius. He was referring to Einstein. Brian was doing something that no one else had done before. If Sir George Martin, Sir Elton John, Sir Paul McCartney, Sir Barry Gibb, if those people all think Brian's a genius, who am I to disagree? But back to your question of painting the man, it's really a difficult task to understand that aspect of him because he is really a regular person outside of the realm of music. And so in my previous book, God Only Knows, which was the massive update of the Beach Boys and the California Myth, I tried to paint him as much as a human as I could. What we found out was, in a sense, he wasn't made for this world.
I guess I just wasn't made for these times.
Exactly. And, you know, it took him a while to express it, but right from the very beginning, we hear this melancholy in a song like The Lonely Sea. The lonely sea. In the warmth of the sun and in my room. Now, where does that all come from? It comes from a childhood upbringing that, by all accounts, was violent. So we have a sense of somebody who, almost from the moment he got out of his baby carriage and was walking, that he was knocked down. So in the book, Brian says, I was a hero and my dad was a villain. Well, you know, Brian tells us exactly what he's thinking in his songs and his song titles. I mean, you think of a song like Time to Get Alone or Busy Doing Nothing. Until I Die, which was one of the things that inspired me to write this book, was how sad it is that he just thinks he's insignificant. Now, he's a practical joker, too. So there were stories that he would call people and say, I'm going to drive my car off the Santa Monica Pier.
Oh, God.
and then drive down there, and there would be this wild chase of everybody going there to stop him from doing that. Well, for Brian, that was just a practical joke. So he's an extraordinarily complex and complicated person. And I think, you know, some of the quotes in the book talk to that complication in a way that, I mean, Brian is so much deeper than the surf, cars, girls, fun in the sun songs. Those are beautiful melodies, but that wasn't Brian Wilson. The warmth of the sun is Brian Wilson. Musically is the way he expressed himself. In a sense, he was giving love to the world at the same time as he was trying to make himself feel better. But we're the fortunate beneficiaries of it.
A lot of weight wrapped up in taking on a project like writing about SMiLE when there's so much behind Brian's entire body of work.
What I really was hoping to do with this book was that I think if you're obsessed with SMiLE, this book is for you. If you love SMiLE, this book is for you. If you love the Beach Boys, this book is for you. If you're a music lover, this book is for you. But how do you get somebody who knows nothing about Brian Wilson, has never heard SMiLE, how do you get them to come to the story? So that first page of quotes that includes Einstein and Beethoven, and that's designed to make somebody go, wait a second, I thought this was the Beach Boys guy. Maybe I need to know more about Brian Wilson and SMiLE.
Yeah.
That's my goal. That's my dream. That would put a smile on my face, that more people came to the music, because that's really all this is about.
You mentioned your previous book, God Only Knows. What was different about the process of writing this SMiLE book versus the process of God Only Knows?
You know, the Beach Boys and the California Myth was the centerpiece of God Only Knows, and then it's bookended by these big updates that kind of explain what the book was when it first came out in '78, and then an update. That was journalism. I was on the outside looking in. With SMiLE, I'm on the inside trying to share as much as I can with people who want to know, what was it really like to be there? And one of my favorite mini reviews of the book, if you will, comes from Nelson Bragg, who was in Brian's band for Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE. He read the book because he's quoted extensively in it. I wanted to make sure I got his quotes correctly. I don't know if you ever didn't read the books you were assigned in high school. So Nelson said that this book makes the Beautiful Dreamer documentary look like the Cliff Notes version of the story. I didn't want to revisit the SMiLE story at all in this book. When I talked to my editor at Omnibus, who had been the editor, was the editor in chief and of God Only Knows, and when I told him about the 20th anniversary of SMiLE coming up in 2024, he said, "What do you have in mind?" I said, "I'd love to publish a book of all the interviews I did for Beautiful Dreamer, because in a documentary, 99% of it gets left on the cutting room floor." And he said, "No, no, we're not going to do that. Interview books don't do well for us. You have to do it as an oral history." And my heart kind of sank because I knew how much work that would be. I knew that would be a year and a half. I didn't want to do it, but when he said that's what, if you want to do a book, that's what it's got to be, I thought for about 5 seconds and said, okay. So I had not read those interviews since making the documentary. And it's like, oh my God, I forgot about the story of David Crosby going up to Brian's house in 1966 to hear what Brian was up to. I forgot about David Crosby picking up Van Dyke Parks and his first wife at the Troubadour and taking them and saying, "You got to hear what this guy's doing." I forgot about so many things because they were, as I said, they were left on the cutting room floor. When I asked Van Dyke Parks to do a new interview for the book, he said, "No, I don't want to do another interview. David, you've interviewed me." And so this interview comes from the interview I did in 2003, 2004 for Beautiful Dreamer. All the band interviews in the book is they were done before the world premiere. There's a drama. It's like, what's going to happen?
Pretty
Is
high
he going to
stakes
go?
stuff.
Is he going to go up on stage and do this? Is he going to drive himself to the hospital into the emergency room and he's sick? There's all these things happening that made us wonder every step of the way. And in the year 2025, we know what he did, but having to write it and then rewrite it and rewrite it and rewrite it a dozen times or so, and then getting a PDF each time from the publisher and reading it again and again and again and again. Each time I was surprised that when I got to 2003, there was drama. But one of the great things of the book, I think, is you get a sense from the people who were there, including myself, that we just didn't know what was going to happen. And what happened was, unlike in 1967, Brian was completely surrounded by people who loved him unconditionally, who weren't waiting for him to write the next hit record, who didn't think that this music was at all strange, but indeed loved this music, and were there to support him every step of the way.
So, how many different iterations did your book go through before it got the green light? Was there drama with that as well?
No, there wasn't any drama with that at all. In the course of, before I even submitted it, it went through constantly editing and rewriting. And I had a terrific copy editor who worked with me every step of the way. And she not only copy edited the book and understands English better than I do, she gets the punctuation in all the right spots.
Yeah.
But in listening, for example, to Van Dyke Park's interview, it's not just the words he says, it's the pauses. So she made sure that I wasn't misrepresenting how he said what he said, because the words on a page have to be accurate. And so there was this long process of getting that done right. Once it got to the publisher, there was no pushback from them. And so it was me changing the book, not I had the complete support of the publisher. What did happen in the course of the book, which was why it was delayed, is that the editor-in-chief, the editor assigned to the book, and the marketing person all left the company during the process. So that, I think, is one of the prime reasons it got delayed. And as a friend of mine on Facebook wrote to me, he says, "Don't be upset that it's been delayed. We're used to delays with SMiLE."
It's a little bit perfect, isn't it? It's serendipitous. So a lot of those changes came from you. How do you even begin to self-edit in the oral history format? I imagine that's quite a challenge when you have hours and hours and hours of interviews that you're working from.
So there's two things. There's one, making sure it flows right. The other is going back and back and back again to to the transcripts of the original interviews, make sure I haven't missed something because I could not interview Carl and Dennis Wilson, obviously. Okay, so let's find some things that they said about SMiLE that will fit in the book so they can be part of the book. Beach Boys themselves, the living members of the group, had just done a book for Genesis, which I think it's called Beach Boys in their own words. And so they were not contractually allowed to do interviews for another book, I was told by their manager. So I couldn't do interviews with them. So I had to find, okay, where did the Beach Boys talk about SMiLE? And there's not a lot in the literature really about SMiLE. One of the things that was also kind of a guiding force in this was if I couldn't see the interview or I couldn't hear it, it really couldn't go in the book. I wanted to make sure everybody was quoted perfectly.
Okay.
And not because there's a lot of articles about SMiLE. There are books about SMiLE. You know, Dominic Priori is the, as Mojo magazine says, the premier smileologist in the world. So there's a lot of stuff, but that doesn't get me to the truth, or as close to the truth as we're going to get. So I had to rely on what I could hear and what I could see. And the other thing that I wanted to do is that makes it a real oral history is I wanted to include everybody in it. And that meant soliciting from fans who were at Royal Festival Hall their reminiscences 20 years later. How do you look back on that night? From people who saw the tour, what what do you think about SMiLE 20 years later? I'm a fan. I just took it to extreme what I've done in my life. But there are a lot of people who are quote unquote just fans. They go to the shows, they buy the records, then there are the hardcore obsessive collectors who have to have everything and every bootleg. And what I loved about the chapter of the reminiscence from Royal Festival Hall is I think there's an emotional quality to it that is almost unmatched in the book. And there's wonderful backstage comments from the band and Brian's friends who were there that night that I had recorded that didn't make the documentary because the documentary ends with Brian finishing SMiLE and taking a bow. So it was wonderful to have those comments. It was wonderful to have Paul McCartney say what he had to say after seeing SMiLE. But the fans it's just beautiful what they had to say.
It really was. I was going to ask you how you went about assembling that chapter specifically because it's so unique to your book to sort of extend the history of the making of this album, excuse me, past the people who made it and into the fans that received it.
Thank you. Thank you for noting that. You're the first person to interview me about this to say that.
Really?
I think it's really important. I thought it was really important. I think I just put it up on my Facebook page. If you want, if you were at the Royal Festival Hall and you want to be part of the book, just send in your reminiscences. And I had an email address. I had somebody working in America and somebody working in England to help gather. It adds a small d democratic feel to the book that everyone has their say. The critics, the band, his friends. And then I realized there were some people for whom just a couple of sentences wasn't going to be enough. And so I had this idea to have an anthology at the back of the book where I could have essays from people for whom SMiLE had a special, particular, and important meaning. That was really a joy to put together because, if Tom Nolan was the person who inspired me back in 1971. So to begin the anthology with an essay from Tom Nolan, and Tom tells a story in there. You asked about what was Brian like as a person. There's him playing a practical joke on his parents. There are emotional essays. Of course, Dominic Priori has a very extensive essay in there. You can't have a book about SMiLE without Dominic being present. There are essays from two British groups who or UK groups who've been influenced extraordinarily by Brian. The Pearl Fishers and the High Llamas wrote something. Um, a dear friend of mine who was at opening night, I asked her to write it because she had been one of Brian's guardian angels in the 70s. No coincidence. She was my late wife's roommate. And so I thought it would be important for her to have a say. I had no idea what she was going to write, and I was kind of stunned when I saw the Mojo review of the book, and they began with a quote from her essay.
Oh, wow.
And it was like, well, that jumped out. I asked Howie Edelson, who's a consultant to the Beach Boys and Capitol and Iconic, to write an essay for the anthology, and he says, "I'll write an essay, but it can't be in the back of the book. It's got to be in the front of the book." And I said, "Okay." And
Sure
and
thing.
I had no idea what he was going to write, but when I got that, that was kind of stunning. And I guess, Melinda Wilson's essay is going to be the last word she's going to have on the subject because she sadly passed away last year. So there's a lot of voices in the book. I tried to do a calculation, and I think something like 75% of the book is other people talking.
Mhm.
And I'm kind of this curator, sequencer, documentarian, if you will. So it was really taking my skills as a filmmaker and applying it to a book. But this time, Van Dyke Parks doesn't get cut off after a sentence or two.
Yeah.
He gets to go on for as long as he needs to go on. And same with Darian Sahanaja and Jeffrey Foskett and anybody who had something that felt to me was important to revealing what was going on. I mean, Probin Gregory, who is one of the sweetest and kindest people you could ever meet, besides being this amazingly versatile musician, some of the things he has to say that reveal what Brian's like. You ask what kind of a person Brian is. I asked Van Dyke that question. He says, "Well, I met Brian through his work." I asked Probin that question, and he has a much more personal reminiscence. Same with Jeffrey Foskett. So there's just all of this um, patchwork that had to do, happily had to do. I mean, this is all labor of love.
Of course. How did you balance your own voice as a writer versus this kind of 75% of the sort of the kaleidoscope of SMiLE?
My voice came in when I felt it was necessary to
Mhm.
contextualize as connective tissue at the beginning of the book there's an author's note why I had to write this book. Why did I have to write this book? After all, there's 2 chapters about SMiLE in God only knows. I made a film about SMiLE. Why does this book need to exist? And I think I state pretty clearly that I've had my say, and whether you agree with my say or not, it's time to give
Mhm.
voice to other people. So it's setting the stage for what this book is.
I'm also so glad that you mentioned the foreword by Melinda Wilson. She was so important to bringing Brian back to the music and reviving
Absolutely.
SMiLE. How did that foreword come about? Did you approach her or did she approach you?
Oh no, I always ask her, and
Mm.
she wrote one for God only knows as
Mhm.
well. Um, she's not interviewed in the book.
I noticed.
I think what she had to say at the top of the book was important enough, and she's in Beautiful Dreamers certainly.
Mhm.
Uh, but there was a momentum to the book that felt. I think she's there once talking about just before going to London,
Mhm.
saying to Brian, this doesn't have to happen. If this is going to make you sick,
Mhm.
no. And no, I have to do it. And I think that's the greatest thing about Brian, this story, is him overcoming, almost 4 decades of fear in
Mhm.
this most courageous way. So it's the triumph of the human spirit, which is an unusual thing to say about
Absolutely.
about a rock book. That gives you an insight into part of what was going on. Uh, Brian made everything fun,
Mhm.
even though he was writing these found songs like "Surfs Up" and "Wonderful" that aren't going to make you laugh. They're not going to make you smile. They're more likely to bring a tear to your
Mhm.
eye. Um, it was fun. That was the way he operated during this period. Uh, how much drugs had to do with all of this? None of us can tell.
Yeah, he's the most controversial acid casualty in rock and roll because we don't actually know if he is one or not.
My sense, and we wouldn't have talked about it, well, back in the day, I wouldn't have
Hmm.
talked about it at all because I didn't know anything about drugs and still don't really. Um, why do people self-medicate, if you will? And Brian is a man of appetites, music, music and food, like right here, and sometimes food's ahead of music. And
Yeah.
as Derek Taylor said, he'd be telling you all about vegetables as he's, in Derek's words, uh, eating the whopping big burger. Uh,
Yeah.
so there are contradictions in all of it. In the books, I talk about drug use, but there were other issues that were either driving him to take drugs or were making it impossible to finish SMiLE the way he wanted to do it. And unless we could do forensic psychology and get in a time machine and go back to that period, we'll just never know
Mhm.
what the balance of all of these reasons were, other than we had this great artist who shelved this remarkable project.
Were there any interviews that really challenged your view of SMiLE?
It's a great question. I didn't get every great quote um, from the Beach Boys that I could have.
Mhm.
There are some that I missed, uh, but nothing that they said at the time. There was nothing from 66, 67 where they said it. And I heard things in private about what was said that contradicted what was said in print interviews. And
Mm.
again, remembering that I said, okay, if it's going to be in the book, I've got to either have seen it or heard it
Yes.
myself. It became difficult to use some of these quotes that
Mhm.
could have fit into the book very well, but I couldn't see it and hear it. While Marilyn Wilson declined to do an interview, there are three great quotes from her where she talks about that era. There's a real honesty and some anger in what she's saying there. As I said earlier, no one's ever going to know the entire story. But given who I've spoken to, given how many people have passed away, given how many people are reluctant to talk on the record, um, given everything we know, we're never going to get much more than what we've got here.
Mhm.
When it comes to 2003, 2004, I wanted that to be the book. I didn't want to write about 66, 67 again. I didn't want to call the book SMiLE. So
What was
there.
your working title?
My working title was a Genius Revealed,
Okay.
the story of Brian Wilson and SMiLE, because I thought that SMiLE was the work that revealed his genius in a way that nothing
Mhm.
else he had done. And the publisher was like, no, no, for the algorithms, for marketing purposes, we need
Mm.
SMiLE in the title. Okay, I'll argue with you, but one of the things that's interesting about book contracts, particularly the ones that I'm signing, is I have complete control of everything that's inside the covers, but not the front or back cover. So when he says the title of the book's going to be SMiLE,
Well,
the,
you
the
go,
title,
okay.
and then it was okay. What subtitle is gonna work for me? That's
Mhm.
gonna, and so that's when we came up with the Rise, Fall, and Resurrection, because everything Brian told me, and you saw it in Beautiful Dreamer. You saw it in how he performed SMiLE on tour,
Mhm.
if you were lucky enough to be there. I'll never forget him coming back from the very first SMiLE tour and calling me and saying, David, you got to come over tomorrow to do an interview. I imagine it was the first time in his life he ever wanted to do an interview.
Oh.
So we went over the next day, and David, this was the greatest tour of my life. SMiLE got better and better every night. In fact, you can't believe this, but I can't wait to go on the road again.
It's like a
First,
complete 180.
a
Oh my
complete
God.
180. And in this interview, I said, "So, okay, Brian, on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you compare Pet Sounds to SMiLE?" I give Pet Sounds a 4 and SMiLE a 10. So,
And I can picture that in that inimitable Brian affect.
and
Did that just
it's
about blow you off your feet? Like, whoa.
Well, it's stunning. We're talking about an album that is typically considered either the first or second or third in all the critic lists of greatest albums of all time. Pet
Mhm.
Sounds is always in the
Yes.
top five. So he's saying that SMiLE is, more than twice as good as that, whatever that means. But in subsequent interviews, he would say Pet Sounds is a seven and SMiLE is a 10.
Mm.
So maybe he started to give himself a break on Pet Sounds. But 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 so 'cause when he said that, I said, "Well, what's so much better about SMiLE than Pet Sounds?" And he looked at me like I was an idiot. He goes, the songs are better, the lyrics are better, the singing's better, the music is better." I was like, "It's all better."
That interview, it sounds like it was a complete breakthrough, not just for your project, but for you as a fan. What other interviews really shaped what this book became?
Another great question. Certainly, Van Dyke Park's interview was
Hmm.
crucial because I don't know if it was the longest interview he's ever done on SMiLE, but it was the longest interview he'd ever done with me about
Hmm.
SMiLE. And so he was able to talk about 66 and 67 in great depth and also about what happened in 2003 and 2004. Uh, Darian Sahanaja, of course, was crucial
Hmm.
to explain how he helped reconstruct SMiLE. Darian never gets enough credit for what he did.
No.
All of the band members' interviews were wonderful. Jeffrey Foskett, late Jeffrey Foskett, I was scheduled to do an interview with him, and he emailed me one day. He says, "David, I don't have a voice today." And I wasn't smart enough to email him a bunch of questions.
Mm.
And then he passed away. The other interviews that surprised me that really were valuable in doing this, Jury Park's interview about 1966, 67. So those were key interviews in shaping it. All the band members certainly. Uh, the interviews that I did for the new book that were surprising, and I don't know why I didn't interview these people for Beautiful Dreamer. I don't honestly know. But Glenn Max, who was the man at the Royal Festival Hall, who essentially commissioned Brian Wilson Presents
Mm.
SMiLE, and Brian's music agent, who worked with Glenn, because the idea was this may be a one-off. Brian may do this once and never again. There was no notion there
Mhm.
was going to be a tour or an album. So they were extremely important in explaining how Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE was economically made possible and then announced to the world. Uh, and Richie Davis, who was Brian's, was at the audio board,
Mhm.
talking to him about how he essentially was conducting the symphony of voices that were coming from the stage, the nine vocals
Mhm.
that he had to make sure were at the right volume.
Because if you're singing a Brian Wilson composition, you've got to get that blend just right. Was there anyone that you really wished you could interview for this?
Well, yeah, I would have loved to talk directly with the Beach Boys in an interview situation as opposed to having to mine interviews they had done to promote the box set. So I
Mhm.
could ask them more specific questions. I'm not sure how much I would have gotten from those interviews. I would have loved to have interviewed Sir Paul. My interview with him backstage in London lasted about 30 seconds.
Mm.
So that wasn't everything I wanted, of course, but everybody always wants more from him, and he gives you
Mm.
exactly what you need. Whether it's 3 minutes, however much time you get with him, you get exactly what you need. It's
Mhm.
almost like he can read your mind. And I had the privilege of interviewing him about Pet Sounds in 1990,
Mm.
and only Pet Sounds. We weren't talking about his new album. We weren't talking about his tour. And I think that was a real novelty for him to be interviewed about something that wasn't about him.
Yeah.
And I think he enjoyed that. And so I've been able to use quotes from that in liner notes
Mhm.
and places like that. But in terms of who else I could have interviewed, that's a great question. And I don't know. Bob Dylan is someone who I would have loved to have interviewed, but is
Mhm.
Bob going to give me what I want?
No.
The interviewing can go on forever,
Mhm.
but who was there is the key. So I wish I had done a longer interview with Chuck Britz and Derek Taylor and David Crosby, but they're not with us. And so, when I did Beautiful Dreamer, I got to interview pretty much everybody who would sit down for the documentary. A lot of people who didn't make the film, like one of my favorite singer-songwriters, Rufus Wainwright. He's in the trailer, but he's not in the movie. Um, so, the guys from Bare Naked Ladies, they're in the trailer, but
Mhm.
not in the movie. Showtime basically said it just has to be under 2 hours. That was the only
Mhm.
note. And I think the first cut of Act One was 6 hours.
Ooh.
So we're slicing and slicing and slicing and slicing. And so there's an awful lot of stuff that never made it into the
Mhm.
documentary that got into the book. So that was thrilling. When Glenn Max at Royal Festival Hall told me about his conversation with Brian at the end of the world premiere week, what Brian told him that ended up on the back cover of the book, that is greatest quote of all, the most cathartic experience of my life. Well, what more can you ask for than it be that,
Mhm.
and that I get to be the one who writes the book about it.
That's all you could hope for, really, as a super fan of anything.
I do have to look at the book and kind of pinch myself and think, is this real?
Mhm.
Going back to who I was in 1971, how is this possible? And I took when I got a couple of copies, I took one up to give one to Brian, and I autographed it for him. I inscribed it with a message,
Mhm.
and I don't think people autograph things for Brian that often. I think
No.
for the most for the most part he spent a lot of years signing stuff for
Mhm.
somebody. So what I had written was to Brian, thank you for making the whole world smile.
Oh.
So it was okay. It's kind of cute. And he opens the
Mhm.
book and he reads it to Brian. Thank you for making the whole world better. And I think that tells us what he thinks of Smile
Mhm.
and what he thinks of what he did with his music. Because, oh, you make the whole world smile. Isn't that cute and clever? But the whole world better. He knows he made the world better with that music. And that's wonderful that, here in 2025, he still feels that way.
Well, you used the word genius in the text and you wanted it in your title. What is genius to you?
I used to teach a course at UCLA. It's called Legends of Songwriting. Originally, it was called Songwriters on Songwriting. I came up with this notion that God whispers, and these are the people who hear what he has to say.
Mhm.
And that's songwriters to me are the most special people. Now, the way Brian writes songs, as he described in a 1965 interview, is he sits at the piano and plays what he calls feels. He
Mhm.
plays until he gets the feeling that he's looking for, the idea that he's looking to express a certain feeling. And it obviously worked for people like me and for you. And so I don't think there's anything more important than the person who can create out of thin air sounds and vibrations that make us feel something as deeply as music. And I think that's what Brian did. And now I've completely forgotten the question.
Well, I mean, the question was what was genius, and I
Oh,
think
oh.
that's a great answer.
So I don't know what genius is. It's genius is an ability to think in ways that almost no one else can, I think. When it comes to Brian, Brian's particular genius was that he could compose these songs, arrange the instrumental tracks, arrange the background vocals, uh, produce the record. And that was something that I don't think anyone had really done before.
I promise, this is the only direct quote that I'm asking you about from the text.
You can ask all about direct quotes you like, but okay, what's
Okay, because I didn't want to spoil everything depending on when this comes out. You call SMiLE the most enigmatic smile since the Mona Lisa after hours of interviews and 350 pages, something like that. What about SMiLE still evades you?
I think for sure we don't know how Brian would have finished it. I mean, that's we will never know, unfortunately. When he told me in 2004 he would have needed another year to finish it, what did that mean? Well, if we look at Good Vibrations, it's a single. He worked on that for months just to finish a 3.5 minute piece. More than anything, Heroes and Villains was eluding him, and he kept recording pieces and pieces and pieces, and the version that came out, single version that came out was not satisfactory for anyone.
I believe the Cantina movement was missing from the single.
Yes.
In the cantina, Margarita keeps the spirit high.
Without those couple movements, it just doesn't really make sense together.
No, it doesn't.
Without the rest of SMiLE, Heroes and Villains is a bit baffling. Like, why am I under arrest, man?
You're under arrest.
Well, that goes to his Van Dyke's sense of humor. So it's enigmatic in that we will never ever know, despite the protestations of Dominic Priori, to he knows how it would have been sequenced into the very solid sequence he put together decades ago. We're never going to know how Brian would have finished it in 1967, because that's really what would be meaningful. That's why it remains enigmatic. I know that I tried in the mid 90s with Brian to come up with a sequence. I was at his house one night and had a bunch of index cards and magic marker and wrote the names of every small fragment on it. And we sat at the kitchen or stood at the kitchen table trying to move pieces around. Good luck trying to do that. One of the things that we know from David Anderley's stories from 1966 is it kind of didn't matter what order the pieces went in. Oh, Brian, you can't take, no, that's perfect as part of Cabanescence. You can't move that to wonderful. Oh, and he does, and he goes, oh my God, that's incredible. It's the pieces that are incredible. And thank goodness Brian accepted that in 2003, and Darian had the computer capability of figuring out with Brian which pieces should be part of Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE. There was no time limit on how long it could be on stage. Darian just knew that this was going to be a new experience for Brian, having toured with him for 5 years, that Brian was used to getting applause after every 2.5 minute song. So this was going to be different. They were gonna go 17 minutes without applause. And it was a staggering moment to experience. All came together in this moment, and they went right into the second movement, which, if you ask me which is my favorite movement, I'll probably pick the second movement because it has Wonderful and Surf's Up in it.
Would you say one of those two are your favorites from SMiLE? Do you have a favorite?
I'm gonna have if you're gonna ask me to pick a favorite SMiLE, I'm gonna have to stick with Surf's Up, because of how it changed my life, and how all these years later it still moves me so deeply. In the same way, if you ask me what my favorite Beatles song is, I'm always going to say "Hey Jude," because those first three and a half minutes, particularly that video where Paul looks directly into the camera and starts singing "Hey Jude," it is just, for me as a Beatle nut, there's nothing like it. If you had walked into a church, 250 years ago, and organist was playing Surf's Up, you might have thought, oh, this is Bach's latest piece. Is when Brian talks about I'm going to write a teenage symphony to God. I think Surf's Up is the song that proves that he indeed did that. Brian didn't ultimately name the album Dumb Angel, and we don't know whether it was reference to his wife or Dennis. Both those stories have been told, but Dumb Angel would be a great name for an album. Brian was not dumb by any stretch of the imagination. Good name for a book.
Might be one to hold on to.
I don't think there's another SMiLE book in my future, but there are more books as long as the keyboard is working.
I think that's a great note to end this on. So is there anything else that you would like to promote to sort of round this thing out? Obviously, the book.
Well, people who haven't bought God Only Knows, there's now a new version of it put out by the publisher that's less expensive. It's the same words. It's just it's a smaller book physically. It was done to go into the bookstalls in England. I don't know where it's going to go here. It may just be online. So I would like people to read God Only Knows as well. In terms of anything else to promote, if I think it may be too late, but if you're not a student, you can take my summer online course on songwriting at UCLA. It's a great 6 weeks where you hear from 2.5 hours or so from the greatest songwriters of the rock era. And so if that were something you were interested in, you would have to go to UCLA summer sessions. But I don't. That's, as I say, that's not an inexpensive journey. I just think if people listen to tracks 1 through 19 on the SMiLE sessions by the Beach Boys, or if they listen to Brian Wilson present SMiLE, they're going to want to know more. They're going to want to know, what the heck is this? Because there's nothing about this music that fits any other pattern of popular music. It remains unique and timeless, both cliches, but it's one of the things I think we all love about what Brian Wilson has done is that he's given us music that isn't stuck in time, and he's done it brilliantly.
SMiLE is a multi-generational thing now. There are fans like David who read about it in the 60s and 70s, then wondered why it never came out. Fans like Darian Sahanaja and his buddies who were introduced through bootlegs in the 80s. Millennials discovered it in the 90s and 2000s through the box sets and going out and buying the Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE CD when it came out in 2004. Some fans like Giggins were fortunate enough to see the show in person. I saw that he interviewed David as well. I deliberately have not watched it yet. And then there's the Zoomer Beach Boys fans. We were the first generation of Beach Boys fans to discover an official, completed SMiLE after the fact. Beautiful Dreamer showed us only a taste of the work that went into reviving SMiLE. For my age group specifically, David's book is so important for putting SMiLE in context. While yes, I live and die by art alongside its historical context, I really wanted to speak to David as a fan. He became a part of the history of his North Star album. He did something all us music fans dream of doing, but very few actually get to do. He lived a music fan's dream and did important work while doing it. Thank you, David, for your history of SMiLE and wanting to talk about it with me. Thank you for allowing me to revisit SMiLE in some way. I can't wait until The Rise and Fall and Resurrection is in my hands. Physically. I was given a Mondo PDF, and I can't wait until it's in the people's hands too, whether electronically or physically. If you're interested in buying a copy for yourself, the US and UK Amazon storefronts will be in my description, as is my website, where you can read about SMiLE and other similar music things. So, once again, what do you think of SMiLE? What do you think of the Beach Boys? If you've already read the book, what do you think of that? Leave a comment letting me know. I love hearing what you guys have to say about albums that I love. And remember, despite what some guy on the internet says, your opinion matters. If you like what I do here, you should like this video and subscribe to my channel. I post new episodes of my flagship series Vinyl Monday mornings at 11, and a new episode of the Dolls Pod, my podcast, every other Friday at noon. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye!